If you stay with us, we're going to continue looking at tariffs, but with wider implications. Brazil and the United States have escalated their row over President Trump's support for coup-accused ex-leader Jair Bolsonaro. US President Trump has slapped a 50% tariff on one of its main steel suppliers. Trump has strongly criticised the prosecution of right-wing ally Bolsonaro, who was on trial for allegedly plotting to cling to power after losing the 2022 elections to Lula. In a letter addressed to Lula, Trump criticised the treatment of Bolsonaro in an international disgrace and said that the trial should not be taking place. He has even further said that Washington would launch an investigation into Brazil's trade practices. While Trump has been issuing letters to trading partners focusing on those his country runs a deficit with, Brazil had until now not been among those threatened with higher duties to come on August the 1st. Following Trump's move, Lula wrote on X that any unilateral tariff increases will be addressed in the light of the Brazilian law of economic reciprocity. Well, thank you, Stephen Nagy, for staying with us. This, of course, is a feud that has been rumbling for some time. Some parallels between Bolsonaro and Trump's own endeavours, of course, both accused with inciting potential violence after an election result, the US with the Capitol, and of course this alleged coup. What is the significance of this tariff? And is this Trump once again using tariffs as a weapon to try and get his own agendas across in the geopolitical sphere?
So I think there's several different layers of this argument. First, I think that President Trump does have an affinity for the former president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, feeling that he was attacked by the same kinds of narratives that the so-called liberal media attacked Mr. Trump very intensively for more than 10 years to try and prevent him from returning to the presidency. And I think that with that, he has a strong, inclination to push back against what he understands as so-called liberal politicians and liberal media attacking politicians that have a similar background and political orientation. So I think this is part of the story. The second part of the story is that Mr. Trump is engaging in a global reset of how we think about trade, including important industries such as steel manufacturing, believing that he may be able to use this as an opportunity to further, bolster steel production within the United States and pull that away from countries like Brazil, but again, other countries that are major steel producers, to strengthen the American economy, but also have a stronger geopolitical position vis-a-vis China. And the third, I think, is that Brazil recently hosted the BRICS summit, and the BRICS summit has been quite explicit in advocating multilateralism, advocating for a push away from the American dollar as the global reserve currency, and trying to decrease their dependence on the American market and the United States in general. And I think that the Trump administration sees this as highly anti-American, highly anti-Trump, and of course against their interest in making America great again. So I think at these three levels we can understand that the Trump administration does have a political side, they have an economic agenda side, and they're thinking about broad positioning of the United States in terms of a new international order where it doesn't have absolute power. It has to deal with a multipolar world in which China, perhaps the global south, perhaps Russia, perhaps Europe, are alternative hubs that make it more difficult for the United States to dominate an international order based on rule of law.
Yes, and I want to look at that point that you've just made there. Of course, Donald Trump positioning himself as the leader, of course, of Make America Great Again and putting America first. You've slightly touched on it there, but I'd like to expand on the opportunity that might open if America is just focusing on itself, specifically looking at trade. We saw after the initial announcements, Chinese President Xi Jinping going to Southeast Asian countries to talk about China potentially filling that gap and unity. Is this a potential shift away from American leadership and domination in certain sectors? And how do you think that shift could play out?
Well, over the long term, that we've seen a relative decline in U.S. power, not because the United States is actually getting weaker. It's that we've seen the rise of the rest, as Fareed Zakaria has talked about. China in 1991 was not really on the economic map, but today it's the #2 economy. And the same can be said for India, Southeast Asia, and others. So it's not that the United States is really losing its absolute or comprehensive power, but there's other countries coming up being competitors. Is China and other countries able to fill the gap? Well, quite frankly, no. And I think that we see this over and over and over. When the Europeans want security guarantees, they're willing to boost NATO spending to 5%. And that is to placate the United States because they want to keep the United States within this loop. When countries want to deal with security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, where I'm based usually, again, they want the United States. When there's big trade agreements, they want the United States. So I think the United States is still seen as that indispensable partner or critical partner to really have credible security, economic, and other policies. And countries that are more or less allied with the United States are going to continue to want the United States in the region. And what we're seeing now is that rather than large-scale multilateralism like the G20 or BRICS or even the United Nations, the U.S. and partners such as Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Australia are working in mini-lateral partnerships to achieve some of their objectives because they see large authoritarian states, whether it's China or Russia or others, fracturing multilateralism, making the United Nations Security Council not work, making ASEAN not work in terms of its consensus-based decision-making, and even the European Union in terms of finding a common ground on human rights issues. So I think, the United States, again, just to repeat, is still the most powerful country. It's still the indispensable country, and it's shifting its broader foreign policy to deal with the real challenges associated with authoritarian states.
Yes, Professor Nagy, if you stay with us, we are now going to move to Europe, and President Donald Trump